Watching this clip, I couldn't help but think how ironic that Whoopi Goldberg and Joy Behar and the rest of the ladies on The View spend their time calling Republicans the conspiracy theorists. But they have been wrong about everything they have said over the last couple of years. They likened President Trump to Hitler. They have mocked him. They have shamed him. They have lied about him consistently on their show. And it was a joy to watch them on November the 6th when they realized that tens of millions of Americans do not listen to the lies that they have spewed. These women are completely out of touch with stating facts that your colleagues have stated in the past.
Okay,
now,
I'm sorry, guys. We're going to come back out to the panel. Karoline, thank you very much for your time.
Been put in there because according to Donald Trump, she's a 10. You know that's what it is.
I want to be clear, though. It's not her first job. It was her first press briefing. She worked in the previous Trump administration.
What I'm saying, this is the first time that she's been she may be, but my point is that job would not maybe have been open to her.
No, I understand.
In a recent episode of The View, tensions escalated as White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt found herself at the center of an intense debate with Whoopi Goldberg and her co-hosts. What began as a discussion about Leavitt's political trajectory swiftly evolved into a spirited exchange, underscoring the deepening divide between traditional media figures and a new generation of political voices reshaping the landscape. The clash wasn't just about individual viewpoints, it was a broader reflection of how political discourse is shifting in modern media. Leavitt, widely recognized for her composed yet assertive communication style, did not back down in the face of sharp criticism from Goldberg and her panel. Her ability to counter challenges with confidence turned what could have been a routine disagreement into a defining moment that highlighted key issues beyond just politics. This discussion touched on media bias, the role of women in leadership, and the evolving perception of conservatism in today's socio-political climate. This exchange served as more than just a confrontation between two opposing viewpoints. It became a moment of reflection on how mainstream media interacts with rising political figures. As we break down this encounter, it's crucial to examine the arguments made, the underlying biases at play, and the broader implications for media and politics moving forward. Whoopi Goldberg, an established television host and actress, has never shied away from expressing her opinions, particularly when it comes to conservative political figures. During this episode, she questioned Leavitt's swift rise to the role of White House press secretary, implying that external influences may have played a larger role in her success than personal qualifications. This line of questioning immediately sparked pushback, setting the tone for a debate that would unfold with increasing intensity. At just 27 years old, Leavitt has already built a reputation as a skilled political communicator, known for her ability to handle high-pressure media environments, respond to difficult inquiries with clarity, and uphold strong policy positions. Her experience in political strategy and public relations speaks for itself, offering a strong counterpoint to Goldberg's insinuation. Rather than allowing the conversation to focus on speculative assumptions, Leavitt redirected the discussion toward her credentials and the broader pattern of skepticism conservative women often face when they achieve prominence in their fields. What made this debate particularly noteworthy was the contrast in approaches. While Goldberg and her co-hosts attempted to frame Leavitt's success within a specific narrative, Leavitt remained unwavering in her defense, choosing to emphasize her professional background rather than engage in rhetorical sparring. This dynamic is part of a larger trend where mainstream media figures challenge the legitimacy of emerging political voices, often applying different standards of scrutiny depending on ideological alignment. The significance of this exchange extends beyond the moment itself. It reflects a growing tension between traditional media gatekeepers and the new wave of political figures who are carving out their own platforms. As audiences become more engaged in direct, unfiltered discourse through digital channels, the way mainstream media interacts with rising voices will continue to evolve. The debate between Leavitt and Goldberg was not just about one individual's career but about the shifting power dynamics in political communication. Joy Behar, another panelist on The View, reinforced Goldberg's perspective, subtly implying that Leavitt's success might have more to do with optics than with genuine ability. The insinuation that a young conservative woman's accomplishments must be attributed to external influences rather than personal competence did not sit well with Leavitt. Without hesitation, she addressed the underlying bias, making it clear that such assumptions were not only dismissive but indicative of a broader trend in media discourse. Instead of resorting to personal counterattacks, Leavitt maintained a composed yet firm stance, delivering a well-articulated response. She pointed out that these types of criticisms frequently stem from an unwillingness to acknowledge that conservative women can achieve success through hard work and talent alone. The implication that her professional achievements were dependent on factors unrelated to her expertise was, in her view, a clear reflection of the double standards often applied to individuals with her political affiliations. Leavitt also highlighted the irony in Goldberg's remarks, pointing out that historically, political and media figures across the spectrum have benefited from mentorship and professional networks. She questioned why her rise should be scrutinized any differently, to suggest that her career trajectory was an anomaly while ignoring the fact that similar pathways exist across political affiliations. She argued, was not only unfair but an intentional attempt to discredit her qualifications. Shifting the conversation to a larger issue, Leavitt took the opportunity to call out what she saw as a pattern of selective criticism within mainstream media. She asserted that programs like The View tend to apply different levels of scrutiny depending on the ideological alignment of the person in question. While conservative figures often find themselves at the receiving end of aggressive skepticism, she noted that their left-leaning counterparts are rarely subjected to the same level of critique. This, she emphasized, was less about fostering balanced debate and more about reinforcing preferred narratives. Sensing that her initial line of attack had failed to gain traction, Goldberg quickly adjusted her approach. Instead of continuing to challenge Leavitt's career credentials, she shifted the focus to her delivery and communication style. She questioned whether Leavitt possessed the rhetorical skills necessary to effectively articulate complex policy matters, implying that her speaking style might not be suitable for the role of White House press secretary. This redirection in argument was a noticeable departure from the initial critique. Rather than addressing the substantive points that Leavitt had put forward, Goldberg sought to undermine her authority by focusing on presentation rather than content. However, this approach did not have the desired effect. Leavitt, maintaining her signature poise, dismissed the critique by reinforcing that her role was not about performance but about clear, accurate, and effective communication. While media figures may rely on charisma and theatrical engagement, her position, she explained, required a focus on delivering policy-driven messaging, something she had consistently demonstrated throughout her tenure. By steering the conversation back to substance, she effectively neutralized the attempt to shift the discussion into superficial territory. This moment underscored the ongoing tension between media personalities and emerging political voices who challenge the status quo. It also reflected a broader struggle over how political discourse is framed in mainstream platforms. The interaction between Leavitt and Goldberg was not just about one individual's competence, it was about who controls the narrative in modern media. The exchange between Karoline Leavitt and Whoopi Goldberg highlights a recurring theme in modern media, the tension between established television platforms and a new generation of political figures challenging mainstream narratives. This particular debate underscored the shifting dynamics of political discourse, where emerging voices are increasingly pushing back against traditional media gatekeepers. Leavitt's ability to withstand pointed criticism without resorting to personal attacks set her apart from the usual exchanges on The View. Rather than allowing the discussion to be steered toward superficial elements like image and presentation, she consistently redirected it toward merit, media objectivity, and the importance of substance over spectacle. By keeping the conversation focused on her credentials and the broader issue of biased scrutiny, she demonstrated an approach rarely seen in mainstream talk show debates. This moment serves as an important case study in how political figures can effectively handle adversarial media environments. Instead of engaging in hostility or deflecting criticisms with counterattacks, Leavitt provided a clear example of how to stay composed, rely on facts, and challenge media narratives with confidence. The response to this exchange was immediate and divided. While The View has a dedicated audience that generally aligns with its perspective, many viewers and political commentators outside that sphere took notice of how the discussion unfolded. The contrast in how different political voices are treated in the media became a significant point of conversation. Leavitt's handling of the situation reinforced the value of maintaining a fact-based approach rather than engaging in debates driven by theatrics. It also underscored the broader issue of fairness in media discussions, whether all perspectives are given equal weight or if some are subjected to greater scrutiny based on ideological alignment. The debate did not end when the cameras stopped rolling. As clips from The View made their way across social media, reactions came swiftly, with audiences dividing sharply along ideological lines. Conservative commentators and supporters praised Leavitt's composure, applauding her ability to navigate the heated exchange without losing focus. They argued that her performance exposed a long-standing issue in mainstream media, the tendency to question the legitimacy of conservative figures, particularly young women who do not fit the traditional media's favored narrative. On the other hand, left-leaning media outlets framed the discussion in a different light. They portrayed Goldberg's critique as a legitimate challenge rather than an unfair attack. Some commentators suggested that public officials, especially those in high-profile positions like press secretary, should expect rigorous scrutiny regardless of their political affiliation. The intensity of the debate reflected a much larger issue: the widening gap in how political figures are perceived and treated in the media. Leavitt's supporters argued that had she been a progressive woman, the discussion would have likely centered on her breaking barriers rather than questioning whether she deserved her position. This discrepancy, they claimed, revealed a bias in media coverage that often subjects conservative figures to a different standard. The conversation sparked by this exchange did not remain confined to political circles. It also reignited discussions about gender and ideological bias in media. Observers noted that conservative women frequently encounter a distinct set of challenges in public discourse, as their successes are often scrutinized in ways that their liberal counterparts do not experience. Some analysts pointed out that while the media is quick to celebrate women breaking barriers in traditionally male-dominated fields, that support is not always extended equally across ideological lines. When a progressive woman rises to prominence, she is often portrayed as a trailblazer. However, when a conservative woman reaches a similar position, her qualifications are sometimes questioned rather than celebrated. This debate ties into a larger pattern seen in political media coverage, where individuals from different ideological backgrounds receive starkly different treatment. The Leavitt-Goldberg exchange served as yet another example of how media narratives can shape public perception and influence broader conversations about politics, gender, and fairness in coverage. Beyond the immediate reactions, this moment had lasting implications. It provided a clear demonstration of how media figures and political representatives interact in a rapidly evolving landscape where alternative media, social platforms, and direct audience engagement are reshaping traditional power structures. Leavitt's response was not just about defending her own qualifications, it was a challenge to the way mainstream media approaches political discourse. By standing firm and countering criticisms with substance rather than spectacle, she set an example for how rising political figures can engage with media platforms that may not always be favorable to them. As debates over media bias, fairness, and ideological divides continue, this exchange will likely be remembered as part of a broader shift in how political figures navigate high-profile interviews. The question that remains is whether traditional media will adapt to the changing landscape or continue to reinforce the same patterns of scrutiny and selective criticism. One thing is certain: the impact of this discussion extended far beyond The View, sparking a larger debate on media accountability, ideological bias, and the evolving nature of political discourse in the digital age. As anticipated, major news organizations quickly seized on the controversy, each offering its own interpretation of the events. Right-leaning media outlets framed the incident as yet another instance of hostility toward conservative voices, particularly young women who challenged the status quo. They emphasized Leavitt's composure and ability to respond with professionalism while pointing out how The View hosts, rather than engaging in a substantive policy discussion, resorted to personal critiques and dismissive rhetoric. Conversely, liberal-leaning publications painted a different picture. They characterized Goldberg's remarks as a necessary critique of political messaging and communication style, arguing that public officials, especially those in high-profile roles like White House press secretary, should expect rigorous questioning. Some analysts suggested that Leavitt's position naturally invites scrutiny, and Goldberg's comments should be viewed as a legitimate challenge rather than an unfair attack. However, what stood out amid this media frenzy was the near-total lack of engagement with the actual policy matters that Leavitt had sought to highlight. Instead of dissecting her arguments on media bias, government expenditures, or political accountability, the conversation largely revolved around the individuals involved. The focus shifted from discussing governance and public policy to analyzing personalities, reinforcing a long-standing tendency in political media to prioritize spectacle over substance. This pattern is hardly new. In the realm of mainstream journalism, it is often easier, and more profitable, to emphasize dramatic exchanges rather than dive into the complexities of policymaking. However, this particular incident provided a stark illustration of how media-driven narratives can shape public perception. Rather than encouraging meaningful debate, the framing of the event largely reflected pre-existing political divisions, with each side reinforcing its own perspective. Following the widespread reaction, The View addressed the issue in a subtle manner over the course of subsequent episodes, though no direct acknowledgement of the backlash was made. Instead, the panelists broadly discussed the role of media in holding public officials accountable, a statement that appeared to be an attempt to justify the aggressive tone of the original interview. While the discussion alluded to the controversy It carefully avoided addressing the specific criticism that had been directed at Goldberg and her co-hosts. Whoopi Goldberg, known for her unapologetic approach to political discourse, did not waver in her position. However, close observers noted a shift in her demeanor in later discussions involving conservative figures. The frustration was evident, perhaps not just from the original exchange with Leavitt, but from the unexpected public response that followed. The assumption may have been that the audience would rally behind the View's position, but the significant pushback suggested otherwise. Meanwhile, Joy Behar attempted a different tactic. Rather than directly revisiting the topic, she chose to introduce lighthearted remarks about political debates on talk shows. While some members of the live audience responded with laughter, media analysts pointed out that this attempt to downplay the controversy did not go unnoticed. Critics of the show remarked that The View has frequently intensified its scrutiny of conservative figures but appears less willing to engage in self-examination when faced with valid criticism. Beyond the immediate fallout, the broader implications of this incident linger. It raised critical questions about how media platforms choose to engage with political figures, the standards applied to different ideological perspectives, and the way public discourse is shaped by selective framing. The debate was no longer just about Leavitt's qualifications or Goldberg's remarks. It had evolved into a larger conversation about media accountability, bias, and the growing distrust in traditional news sources. As public attention gradually moved on, the impact of this exchange remained significant. It reinforced the reality that mainstream media no longer holds an uncontested grip on political narratives. With the rise of alternative media, direct-to-audience communication channels, and social platforms, figures like Leavitt can now respond to criticism without relying on traditional gatekeepers. This shift challenges long-established power structures within journalism, forcing outlets to reconsider how they engage with emerging political voices. In many ways, the controversy encapsulated a defining moment in modern political media, one that showcased both the persistent divides in public discourse and the evolving ways in which political figures navigate media scrutiny. As the landscape continues to shift, the question remains, will mainstream platforms adapt to this new reality, or will they continue to reinforce the same patterns that have led to increasing skepticism and disengagement from traditional news? Sources: for Karoline Leavitt, this exchange became a defining moment in her career. While The View may have intended to question her credibility, the encounter ultimately worked in her favor, solidifying her support among conservatives and amplifying her influence within political circles. Instead of being put on the defensive, she used the opportunity to reinforce her stance and demonstrate her ability to hold her own in adversarial media settings. The debate did not weaken her position, it strengthened it. In the aftermath, Leavitt took full advantage of the momentum generated by the discussion. Rather than shying away from the controversy, she addressed it head-on in multiple interviews and public statements. She reiterated her concerns about media bias, stressing that conservative voices, particularly young women in leadership roles, are too often dismissed or undermined based on assumptions rather than merit. By positioning herself as an example of this dynamic, she was able to turn a challenging situation into a broader discussion on fairness in media representation. Her response showcased not just resilience but also strategic thinking. Unlike many press secretaries who prefer to sidestep confrontational interviews, Leavitt demonstrated a willingness to engage directly, a trait that resonated with her audience. She did not simply defend her record, she reframed the conversation, making it about more than just her. By highlighting the broader issue of selective criticism in media, she ensured that the discussion extended beyond a single television segment. This moment also signified a larger shift in political communication. The traditional model, where public figures rely primarily on mainstream media to shape narratives, is increasingly being challenged. More politicians are bypassing conventional news channels, opting instead to communicate directly with their audiences through digital platforms. Leavitt's swift and calculated use of X, formerly Twitter, as well as interviews with conservative media outlets, allowed her to take control of the narrative. Instead of being defined by The View's framing, she crafted her own messaging, ensuring that her perspective reached a broad audience without being filtered or distorted. The confrontation between Leavitt and Goldberg serves as a microcosm of the changing relationship between politicians and legacy media figures. Television platforms like The View have long wielded influence in shaping political discourse, but their dominance is increasingly being contested by alternative media, social commentators, and direct engagement strategies. The growing distrust in traditional outlets has led many public figures, particularly conservatives, to seek new ways to connect with their base. For Leavitt and others in similar positions, the playbook is clear: engage proactively, challenge prevailing narratives, and harness digital tools to amplify their message. This approach has been successfully employed by numerous political figures in recent years, marking a significant transformation in how officials interact with the public. The ability to control messaging without intermediaries is proving to be a powerful asset in today's polarized media landscape. Meanwhile, platforms like The View face the ongoing challenge of maintaining credibility while participating in politically charged discussions. As audiences become increasingly divided and skeptical of traditional media, the need for balanced, fact-driven conversations is more important than ever. However, as this incident highlighted, the temptation to focus on personalities rather than policies remains a dominant trend in mainstream discourse. The long-term impact of this exchange will not be limited to Leavitt's career alone. It is a reflection of the broader shifts occurring in political communication, media consumption, and public engagement. Whether mainstream outlets will adapt to this evolving landscape or continue reinforcing the same patterns remains to be seen. However, one thing is certain: politicians and media figures alike must recognize that the way narratives are shaped is changing, and those who fail to evolve risk losing relevance in an increasingly fragmented information space. The exchange between Whoopi Goldberg and Karoline Leavitt may have been just one episode in the broader political and media landscape, but it stands as a revealing case study in how debates unfold in today's deeply polarized environment. It highlighted not just the clash of ideologies but also the shifting expectations of audiences who are no longer content with predictable narratives or rehearsed talking points. For Leavitt, this moment was more than just a high-profile confrontation. It was an opportunity to demonstrate her ability to remain composed under pressure and assert her positions with confidence. Far from being rattled by the pointed criticism, she turned the discussion into an advantage, reinforcing her credibility as a political figure who can hold her ground even in hostile settings. Her handling of the situation resonated with her supporters and strengthened her standing among those who value direct, issue-focused engagement. For The View, the exchange served as a reminder that audiences are becoming increasingly aware of media bias and are no longer as receptive to one-sided discourse. The backlash following the segment suggested that viewers expect more than just partisan rhetoric. They want substantive discussions that address real issues rather than personal attacks or dismissive commentary. In an era where information is more accessible than ever, mainstream platforms must adapt to a changing media landscape where credibility is constantly scrutinized. Ultimately, this debate was about much more than a single television appearance. It reflected the broader cultural and political shifts that continue to reshape modern media. As figures like Leavitt challenge the dominance of legacy platforms and redefine how political figures engage with the public, the question remains: will traditional media evolve to meet the demands of a more engaged and skeptical audience, or will it resist the tide of change? Only time will tell.